Union Jack. Mum always said she should have gone back home and rivers of blood ran deep in the current of Enoch Powell's hate. The Tiber foaming with blood and urgent encouragement of re-emigration. Send them back, load the ships with chocolate smiles and send them back before blacks take the whip hand. No blacks, no dogs, no Irish, one down and a million to go. But una barnya, my mum said. So I sweep the Union Jack under my bed.
I'm Shona Hunter. I'm based here in the Carnegie School of Education. Welcome to hopefully what will be a really nice evening of discussion, of performance. We've got a great film. Before we started, I just wanted to do an introduction really about the kind of genesis of this event. So it's come out of work that I've been doing over a long period of time, but work that quite a lot of other people here have been involved in. Jo Shah and I, you'll meet Jo and hear a bit more about her in a little while, curated an event that happened down in London last year called Performing Grace, which considered the sorts of themes that we'll be looking at and considering tonight, which were around really processes of racialisation and how racial formations are operating in the kind of contemporary moment, looking at that in relation to the arts practice and all of those sorts of things, but in the general kind of culture. So some of the, well, all of the discussion really that we're having tonight picks up on aspects of that event, but really this is part of an ongoing conversation that Jo, myself and a number of the other contributors tonight have been having and that I've been having with various people over the years. And that the school, so we've got Centre for Race, Education and Decoloniality in the School of Education here at Carnegie, or there at Carnegie up in Headingley. And I can see we've got our Dean and one of the heads of subject in the audience there. So we've been having, and we are having, these sorts of kind of conversations in the context of the school, and they kind of inform the work that we're doing there. So just very briefly, I wanted to think about what this notion of to disorient something actually means, because that notion of disorienting rather than disrupting or challenging was a very deliberate choice on my part to kind of frame the conversations that we're having this evening and the work that I'm engaged in and that many of the kind of panellists are engaged in. So Sara Ahmed, in her queer phenomenology quite a few years ago, gosh, a long time ago now, 2006, actually talks and uses and develops this idea of disorientation as a political kind of mechanism. And as a way, I suppose, of thinking about how we can redraw the politics of social justice, I suppose. Sara wouldn't quite put it in those terms. But so I just wanted to read from towards the end of that book to give you a sense of the framing for this evening. So in calling for a politics that involves disorientation, which registers that disorientation shatters our involvement in a world, it's important not to make disorientation an obligation or a responsibility for those who identify as queer. So Sara comes particularly in that volume from rethinking our ways of doing politics via all sorts of ideas from queer, but really when Sara's engaging in those ideas, she's engaging in them from an intersectional kind of perspective. I deliberately left her terminology rather than inserting my own there. So this position demands too much. For some, a lifelong commitment to deviation is not psychically or materially possible or sustainable, even if their desires are rather oblique. But it also forgives too much by letting those who are straight stay on their line. So it's not up to queers to disorientate straights, just as it's not up to bodies of colour to do the work of anti-racism. Although, of course, disorientation might still happen, and we do this work, disorientation then would not be a politics of the will, but an effect of how we do politics, which in turn is shaped by the prior matter of simply how we live. And so for me, that really quite nicely encapsulates some of the views that I have on politics, and certainly the ways in which we're engaging in the political this evening. So I just wanted to do that framing for you. I'm going to hand over to Anne Chander before Joe and myself.
Evening and welcome. When Shona invited me to chair this conference, she asked me to reflect on why I felt this subject was important. And there's a lot that I could say. I could talk about microaggressions that some of us experience. I could talk about the polite smiles, the keeping ourselves small, or conventional. And then I thought, actually, for me, it's quite simple, really. I'm here on the programme and on this slide as Anne Chander, and I submitted that. But actually, that's not my name. My name is Anju. And since I was 18, I've been westernising my name, and I found it increasingly hard to reclaim the name that my parents very lovingly gave me, because I've built up somewhat of a public profile. And many of us contend with this on a daily basis, and frankly it's exhausting, at times it's stressful, but then we have opportunities like this to come together and discuss these issues in an emotionally correct way, where we hear each other out, we share our life experiences, and we use this time with each other in this room tonight and outside of today to connect. And that's why I'm grateful for being invited to chair the conference tonight. I originally met Dr. Shona Hunter on LinkedIn. She'd come across one of my blogs. I've been an avid follower of hers and Dr. Joe Shah's work ever since. You can read all about their accomplishments in the programme, so I'm not going to eat into time too much, except to say that the work they're doing is so important, and it's important for us as individuals, as academics, as artists and citizens of the world to participate in these kind of conversations, and also to encourage others to do that as well.
First, before we kind of enter into this conversation about power, this obsession of ours, power and identity, I wanted to just give you a bit of a sense, I suppose, of the sorts of work that I've been doing, and Jo will kind of talk to the work that she's been doing over the last few years. But yeah, White Spaces is a project that has been going now for about 10 years. So kind of why of having this event at this point in time was partly related to like a bit of a 10-year birthday that I didn't really know was happening until it kind of was upon me. But anyway, yeah, so White Spaces is has developed over the years as a kind of very broad, globally kind of connected initiative of scholars, activists, professionals, people from kind of all sorts of different contexts who are interested in thinking about what it means to be white, what it means to be white in a world where you're not obviously always racialised, so or you're not necessarily aware of your own kind of racialisations anyway. So we kind of, there's a set of themes that we've been thinking about and working with in relation to white spaces, and a lot of that you'll kind of get a sense of when I talk about these issues of power and why my interest in them. But one of the other things that we were, and that I was very keen to do via the White Spaces work, was to develop different ways of working academically in relation to kind of cutting into equalities practices, so the sorts of everyday institutional ways in which we understand equality, and to really start thinking differently about that, to take very seriously the knowledges and the power of the work that is actually going on outside of the university and university spaces, and develop strong collaborations within the context of the university. So, I mean, I won't talk about, you can find out more about the network, find out all the sorts of different things we've been doing over the years. But I suppose one of the things that's important for me to say, and then I'll pass over to Jo, is that actually, I think I've probably come back to really starting to understand of the power of sitting in a university space as well. And I think I've always been ambivalent about that location in the context of the university, because it is a seat of power, it is a seat of whiteness, and it frames a lot of the ways in which whiteness works. And it certainly sustains practices of whiteness, even when it's looking to challenge those practices. And that's something that really, I suppose that's probably at the heart of the White Spaces work, really, in terms of our ideas, the collaborations we've been developing over the years, and the practices, and how we kind of cut into the world, if we do, I don't know. Yeah, okay, so I just threw the clicker. Going to move on to Jo. I'm very bad at containing myself.
I pressed the buttons, but it didn't work. Hang on, let's try this one. Hello? No.
She works at the drama school.
And doesn't know how to use a microphone. Right, okay. In that capacity, I promise I'm actually quite a good teacher. I just feel the need to say that because it's being filmed. Okay, so I'm Jo Shah. I define myself as an interdisciplinary academic because my specialisms straddle a range of different areas, primarily sociology, media education, and policy. But within that, I'm really interested in the concept of the performativity of socialization, so the idea that we're socialized into identities, and then how do we consciously and subconsciously perform those identities in social spaces. So that's my work, and it's largely sort of manifests in the work of the Social Performance Network, which is a network that I set up just shortly after the Performing Rights event in November last year. So we've been steadily growing, and we continue to do work around opening up conversations like the one today, and working closely with the White Spaces Network as well. But the idea really is to bring nuance to the conversation around race, because I think sometimes it's very polarised, it's sometimes a little oversimplified, and that can be quite counterproductive, particularly because within the current binary discourses, individuals that don't identify with singular racializations, or individuals that have affiliations with a multicultural kind of context. There's a colonial aspect to this as well. I mean, all of those sorts of conversations seem omitted from the dominant discourse. So the idea really is to bring nuance through my work. I think that roughly captures what I'm about. Also, I love leotards, dancing and art, so the Social Performance Network will sometimes quite literally approach these topics in those sorts of mediums.
Jo's happier with that sort of thing than me. Okay, right, so we're just going to kind of cut into the conversation then. How we've done this is we're going to be reasonably free-flowing. We know each other quite well, but we've got some key questions that we're using to kind of frame our conversation. So really, I suppose this is the first one, and Jo's already kicked us off a little bit in relation to hers, into her kind of core interests, I suppose. But because we have got a very clear sense of certain kind of perspectives, rationales and practices that we are critiquing in our work and in our everyday practice, kind of we wanted to start off with thinking about what is it really that we're speaking, and I put the back in and we agreed the back, didn't we? What is it that we're speaking back to? What is it that we imagine needs to be addressed here? And I think that's kind of quite important for us to bring that to the table, kind of at the beginning, and let's see where we go from there. So I suppose for me, when I'm thinking about current discourses around social justice, but in particular current discourses and practices around race equality, what it means to have a kind of, I mean, do we even talk about multiculturalism? I don't know whether we do really. It's interesting actually to even pose that question as to whether that's something that's actually on the agenda any longer. But I suppose for me, my core kind of bone of contention in relation to everyday practices, but also how this gets analysed, talked about and engaged with in an academic context, even where we might be having a complicated analysis, but actually in practice, is that power is not adequately theorised, generally speaking, for me. And it's certainly not engaged with in kind of daily practices in the sorts of ways that I think I would like it to be. So one of the things that's been really useful over the last kind of, and then I'm going to switch to you and I think pass, give you a chance to say something maybe soon. I think one of the things that's been really important and helpful over the last kind of couple of 3 years in particular has been the publication of books like Reniero Lodge's Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People. Of course, we've had Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility that's come out in terms of this kind of book intervention over the last year or so, although she's been writing about that kind of concept for a little while kind of earlier. But so we've actually got a lexicon now within the public domain, supported more or less broadly to at least kind of be able to start having conversations about how whiteness fits into conversations about race and how whiteness actually operates as an orientation to power, as it is an embodiment of power. So that, in one sense, has been very helpful to those of us that have been doing work in this area for 20, 30, 40, all of us on the panel in our different ways are speaking back to whiteness and notions of kind of power and privilege. But this notion of privilege, which is the one that's been most often taken up in the context of the public sphere, is the one that actually concerns me. Because in terms of how we think about privilege and how we conceptualise that as something that can be owned, dealt with, I mean, a very long time ago now, there was a lot of work that was coming out by Peggy McIntosh, actually. She was very influential, back end of the 80s, early 90s, talking about whiteness as a set of privileges that we carry on our backs like a knapsack. That kind of went out of fashion, and then more recently we've got other kind of ways of thinking about privilege. But from my point of view, that it excludes an awful lot of the aspects of the conversation that I think need to be kind of brought to the table. It often doesn't enable us to engage with ideas of the relationality of power, of what it is actually that it means to dominate somebody, which is actually often what we're talking about in relation to race and racism. It's not only about certain people having privileges, it's about how our privileges and how our power actually gets used in the context of the public sphere, in the context of the work that we do, and in the context of our daily lives. So from my point of view, and this might sound bizarre, but our notions of power, after talking about the whiteness stuff, but our notions of power are still deracinated for me a lot, because we don't necessarily understand notions of privilege in relation to the histories of coloniality out of which they're born. And this is, I mean, you'll see as we're moving through the conversation tonight, hopefully, this is kind of really important to bring us to the knowledge as to what damaging practices are actually being enacted through the taking on of a position of privilege. So there's a lot in there, but I suppose that's kind of my key, that's a starter in relation to kind of what I'm speaking back to and the way in which I would like the conversation to have more kind of nuance. So it's in terms of context, I think. Yeah, and I think finally there's an aspect that that we leave out which becomes very important in relation to institutional spaces and how power gets practiced, which is about how power manifests as a form of control that we might not understand as codified racially. So all sorts of neoliberal accounting practices, the relationships between different people in professional contexts that actually manifest in terms of one person wanting to control a situation, a space, an outcome, all of those sorts of things, and this is something that we very, very rarely unpack, actually manifest as forms of control which get hooked into in invisible kind of ways how race works in all sorts of different everyday contexts.
And I think what I would say to that would be, so extending that whole conversation around power to the context of enactment or performativity. I think there are a set of unspoken rules, and there is a lexicon that is sometimes unspoken, where as a person of colour you will know that you have to present, behave, speak in particular ways, in particular settings, in particular contexts, to reach certain stages of acceptability or acceptance. And that acceptance might manifest in being enabled with the opportunities that those with privilege take for granted. So, I mean, I'm talking a little bit abstract at the moment, but I mean, just bringing this into a practical sense. So, in a practical context, I mean, looking at myself, I'll just take myself as an example. So I grew up in a working class sort of family. My parents were first generation immigrants from the period of the 60s. And I learned very early on that to succeed, to be successful, I would need an education, because that education was used as almost like a currency, you know, so we don't have anything material at the moment, but education is the way to go. That would help you at some point. So there was the education element, and then there was the element of, right, okay, well, what do you do once you have the education? Well, with education, depending on the levels of education you achieve, comes social mobility, in theory, but it might come with a lot of hard work, but it will come at some point. Okay, so then what do you do with that social mobility, that upward social mobility? That in itself has elements of performativity attached to it. And that performativity relates to whiteness and how you perceive whiteness as a person of colour. And how you perceive whiteness as a person of colour will be very different. Lenny Henry does a really interesting sketch on this, where he talks about the first generation colonised who came to this country, and how they interact with whiteness. You know, there's almost a aspirational relationship there. An apologetic relationship sometimes. A need to be accepted. That need, you know, can somehow be seen as some sort of measure of having made it, fitting in, you know. But then I think people like me came along, the ones that were born here, and that kind of interaction with whiteness just wasn't something that came naturally, because those contexts of colonial memory weren't there. So it's just, for me, I guess, in terms of my personal lived experiences, but then also the experiences that I witness elsewhere, and you know, when you're talking about this the power praxis, it's just really interesting to see how that's also evolved, and how, in terms of how that's reacted to, how that's responded to by people of colour, and how performance plays a part in that. I will talk differently when I'm in a predominantly Asian environment. I'll talk differently when I'm in a multicultural environment. I'll talk differently when I'm in a predominantly white working environment. It's almost like you find these different personas, and fundamentally, the way that you're oppressed through these power complexes is that you're always having to compromise your authenticity.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Powerful. Sad. Makes me want to cry, but it's also good. No, I think that is interesting, because I think that's kind of taken us to one of the things actually that we were talking about. So Joe and I have been having these conversations for a long time, but we also did plan a little bit about what we wanted to say today. Okay, the clicker's really not being my friend today at all. But I was thinking about one of the issues about privilege and why it's kind of taken on a lot of momentum in the public sphere. So, and this kind of critique that I've placed on the table around thinking about whiteness as a form of privilege. So I think one of the things that it can get, I think one of the reasons it's been easy for people to start thinking about power in relation to privilege is that they can understand these ideas around social aspiration, about what it means to have like mobility within a family, or they're things that actually whiteness can hook into. And so I think this is kind of one of my core issues with this stuff. So if we look at me, we've got me here. This is kind of a very good, I've written about this in a lot of different ways and talked about this in a lot of different ways. But I think this placing of ourselves in relation to issues of power, domination, coloniality and all this stuff. So I think the other thing that Joe said there that speaks to one of the things that I was trying to get at in that first instance with the laying out of those ideas is this, the lack of colonial, I mean you didn't, that's not quite how you put it, but around not having a memory around kind of coloniality quite the way that your parents would have done. And we'll be coming into this idea of memorialisation, coloniality, what that means to different people. But of course, you might say that my family had no memories of coloniality in that way. Now, of course, they did in all sorts of ways. I've got my dad and my dad's family are Irish, so you could say that there's part of the last colony there, or one of the last, or we could. So there are relationships to coloniality through white kind of lineages and histories in my family that I think white folks can tap into quite easily, right? But if we don't talk about coloniality in its broadest sense, thinking about the multiple connections that relates to, then that recourse to thinking about ourselves via coloniality, even via ideas of whiteness, so ideas of Irishness, for example, in my own family, can become very, very problematic, because what they can do is recenter ideas of whose experiences in relation to coloniality kind of become important. So I think one of the things here is about situating coloniality in relation to our experiences, our personal experiences and our involvement in those. And when we start to do that and look at our, for instance, all of our family backgrounds, every single one of us in the room will have a relationship to coloniality. Many of us may be more aware of that, or may have a certain narrative around that is one, but there may be many. So the other part, sorry, clicker, not my friend again. So another part of my family story is that my dad was policing in Birmingham at the time that these photographs were taken. There's lots of kind of elements to my engagement with these photographs that I don't really want to go into today. But for me, my dad was at the forefront of policing racial colonisation within the context of this country. And that's kind of got a relationship actually to Irishness and the Irishness in my family and the relationship to class and all of those sorts of things. But I think if we don't start talking about these multiple cuttings, so that's not my dad being a friendly face, right? That's not what I'm trying to say, okay, for translation for anyone in the room that was mistaking that. You know, these are pictures of domination and brute force at their kind of most powerful, really. I mean, my partner and I were watching did anyone watch Margaret Thatcher the other night? BBC Two, Margaret Thatcher doc, we put ourselves through it. Anyway, it was really interesting because we were looking at the pictures of policing that were going on at this time, and it really, really was like an internal war, you know? We were warring in the context of the country, and those of us that were being called to that Francis of Assisi kind of what is it, the harmony, I can't even remember the quote, it sticks in my throat. She said, you know, the Francis, the bringing together of harmony that that she kind of presented herself as here to do at the beginning of that point in time, quite obviously was harmony for some people and not for others, right? And the means and mechanisms are part of my life, as well as they're part of all of our lives. So I think this is what I mean by, like, privilege doesn't really cut it, right? My family weren't necessarily privileged, if you want to look at it in the way we often think about privilege. But of course they were. I gained from this. I'm here, you know? So... yeah, okay.
What's the next slide?
I don't know. Well, there was something about our personal investments,
Yeah,
right? So
yeah.
and then maybe about us working together.
Okay.
5, we've got 5.
Oh,
Should we
okay.
do why we're working together?
Yeah.
Let's do that.
Oh, do you want to do you? Just
Oh,
quick?
yeah, I should actually do this. It's quite an
Because
interesting
this is why we're working together, actually.
Yeah,
Sorry to cut
yeah,
in.
yeah,
Yeah.
in
So
some
there's
ways.
me. That's my history. That's me.
So, I started delving into my family history sort of around my teen years, when I felt really, I guess, really conflicted about belonging and identity, and I didn't quite know where I quite fitted in. Because even though I was born here, I didn't feel like I was being fully accepted as a British person. That label of Britishness always seemed to be limited somehow. Kind of, there seemed to be a kind of a limiting factor to it, you know. So I was British if I assimilated, whatever that meant. I was British if I, you know, so on and so forth. So I started delving into my personal history, and I found this ancestor here, which was quite a shock. 2 ancestors, actually. Says Major General Sir Malik Mohammed Umar Hayat Khan. He was one of the first people of colour to be knighted by Queen Victoria for his services to the Crown. And he was also, affiliated with King George the 5th, 6th, etc. You have Malik Khizr Hayat Tivana, his son, who was also knighted. I was quite uncomfortable finding out these family histories. I won't go into the detail of their lives, but their lives were very colonially compliant. And they performed that compliance, as I'm sure many of those of us who have ancestors from those sorts of regions will relate. It was quite rare to encounter narratives of resistance. And I had hoped that I'd find, I don't know, a Gandhi or a Jinnah or someone in my family history, but what I found were very compliant, colonised individuals who were being rewarded for their compliance. So what that raised for me then was this question, well, clearly, you know, you can't be more British than being part of the British Empire, having fought for the British Empire, which they did, being knighted for your services to the British Empire. And then you fast forward 3 generations or so, and your great-great-great-niece is being called a Paki. I couldn't make that connection in my head. I didn't quite understand. So what made them British before, and made us British, but didn't make me British anymore, even though I was born here? I still don't understand that. I just don't get it. So I think for me, it's been this stark realization that power percolates through the colonial ideologies of oppression, which still exist. So this idea of policing people's identities and policing who is at what point, what agency they have, what power they have, and whether their voice is important or not, is something that you can still see resonating through different systems. Whether it's prison, mental health, or education, you know.
We'll connect,
Well, that's a whole other conversation.
Or is it? Or is it?
Oh, I don't know.
I mean, or is it
Maybe,
really? On a
maybe.
serious, I know, how long? 1 minute now? 2 minutes, 1 each? Okay.
Oh.
Oh.
Before your Q&A.
Before our Q&A, so we can Yeah, no, I mean, I think that really those connections are crucially important for me. I mean, that's the other thing about this, being able to use our own personhood and to investigate and work through that. And this really is, I think, probably one of the reasons that we work together, isn't it?
Yeah.
But to refuse to view that personhood as something that works via individuality. It is, you know, to understand ourselves as enacted through the multiple relationships, and we've not even teeny scratched the surface of the things that we've been talking about there that we're situated in, of the multiplicities that we'll be talking about today, and of kind of our relationship with one another, really. I mean, I think it's so, you know, I kind of encouraged Jo to bring those slides back, didn't I? I was like, she's like, oh God, we can't say the same thing again. I'm like, it's not. It's a different thing because it is about the connections, really, between those histories, because there are connections, direct or long line, generational connections between the two histories, and also, I suppose, the points in time at which we grew up, our positionings in relation to mine, in relation to Birmingham, Jo's in relation to East London. Oh God, I'm thinking of that was a very bad impression. Anyway, yeah, so I think this is really important because, I mean, joking aside, the power is absolutely personal, but absolutely enacts institutions, practices of domination, all of these things at the time that we are sitting in the room. Even, you know, my white slippages of the desire to control everything, which I'm also writing about. It's like a writing through. Okay, but anyway, that's there. I'm going to Jo for a millisecond.
Okay, what I like about these types of conversations and working with Jonah is it's the difficult conversations, but trying to sort of position those difficult conversations within the personal but also the broader contexts. So I like the idea that when we're engaged in these difficult conversations, they're not constantly personalised, which I think is one of the things that I would criticise, I think, around racial discourse. Everything ends up being really personalised to the point where it's like, you know, on one hand, this is this argument that, you know, I don't want to represent a community. Yet, on the other hand, if whiteness is mentioned, you will be confronted by guilt, defensiveness, fragility. And I think at some point, to move forward with real anti-racist work, a modelling of more of this, where the nuances can be discussed, and it's not a personal attack on anybody. It's just an observation of systems, processes, and as Foucault would say...
Did we really do that? Go on.
The way shitty power percolates. That's word for word, that is.
Yeah,
okay. But, that's
Yeah.
what I would say.
But I think there's something about accountability which is important about how we work.
I think accountability... Sorry, I will go off in a minute. I think accountability...
The tech is really not our friend. Yeah.
I think accountability is important, but I think it's being aware of what one is being held accountable for,
Okay, yeah.
and how they'll own that, and what they can actually even do. Yeah.
Okay. Could have a row for you.
Well, I just have to say very quickly. I think those that were performing the roles of the compliantly colonialised had as much of a role to play in reinforcing whiteness as anyone else. So I think we need to. That accountability has to be extended to a nuanced conversation around race. It's not as straightforward as victimhood and victimized. Of course, colonialism was what it was, but what I'm saying is that there was a lot of reinforcement, and there still is to some extent, if we look at the conversations around colorism.
Well, completely, yeah, okay.
So I'm going to open it up to the floor. That was fascinating. Thank you so much. And I don't know about the rest of you, but it certainly stirred up a lot of thoughts in my own mind, especially this, something that I referred to at the start when I opened, which was about emotional correctness and the spaces and the places for us to have these conversations, which the two of you nicely covered. And the most important thing that you said right at the end there, Joe, was about this isn't about blame. It's an acceptance that these things do happen without the denial, putting ego aside, putting a lot of emotion aside, and that's not always an easy thing to do. So do we have questions? We're not going to use Slido. That's
We've given up on that bit of the
We've
tech.
given up on Slido. So we're going to be low tech, and we're going to just take some questions. So if you want to raise your hand, and I can bring over the mic if anyone has a question.
Thank you. I'm just wondering whether we're being slightly naive if we think about the language that we're using and our expectations of people of colour or difference, whatever that difference or diversity is, when they're in the thick of it, expecting people to challenge the things that you're saying should be challenged, because actually I'm wondering whether it cuts deeper than we're actually giving it credit for. And one of the things that I think I've become aware of recently is how impulsive, it's almost like a natural instinct. It's not even like learned behaviour, it's that people react in a way that cuts deeper than conscious thought. And so I'm just wondering whether the solutions that you're suggesting perhaps feel a little bit naive to me, bearing in mind how endemic and entrenched and potentially genetic I feel this whole problem actually is.
That was an excellent question, and it definitely is. The way we respond can be emotive and subconscious, and is so subtle and deeply ingrained. So, love to hear your thoughts, Joe and Shona.
I just wanted to say that there by no means anything discussed here was framed as a solution. Yeah, just want to clarify that. It's an entrenched power issue which comes with a range of trauma and histories, and that's not that you can't erase that, and you can't reconcile that in a really quick and short-lived way. That's not what this is about. What this is about is opening up a conversation that goes beyond the script, if that makes sense. So the idea that, okay, you have, as a person of colour, I have some very strong experiences and perspectives, which aren't just from my past, they'll be even from today. I can predict there'll be more experiences tomorrow. Yeah. But if I am doing this work, I need to be able to think of how other comrades, so to speak, lack of a better word, sorry, you can... but how others might be also experiencing that and feeling that. So what can we do? We don't have a solution, but we can have a conversation. And sometimes the conversations that we see play out in the mass media are a bit counterproductive and a bit too... Those are too naive and simplified.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, what you're raising is crucial. And in my own work, I mean, all we're doing really is scratching the surface of provoking, I suppose, in a way, us to engage with a set of ideas in a sort of different way. But I think there's a couple of things in the question that you've asked there. We are all multiply positioned, right? So your perspective sounds a very sophisticated one, and I'm not that surprised, right? There's a lot of people who look like me, who are like so far behind, you know, and even this is really, I mean, the solutions thing, yeah, I'm not even, there aren't any solutions. I mean, I don't mean that you can't change, but those things they're so complicated and they're so multifaceted, but that doesn't mean we don't do stuff. So, but the stuff around the unconsciousness and the livedness and the location of this stuff in our bodies, absolutely, absolutely. You can see it located in my body. I mean, you know, I've kind of joked, and some of us, like, we're having a bit of a laugh, but it's there, of course it is. It's in my behaviours, it's in my actions. I'm completely, all the time, trying to think of those things. I mean, I think we had lots of stuff to talk about, really, but Melissa Phoebos doesn't talk about racialisation necessarily. She's interested in the ways in which we live domination through our kind of liveness. I use psychoanalytic ideas, right? I mean, that's some people's cup of tea and not others. But I do think that as a culture, and I use that notion of culture advisedly, I'm talking about most cultures in the context of the global colonial, there's like some similarity, right? In that they're dominated through ideas of whiteness and through ways of being. The livedness of our bodies is actually framed through how white folks went around and chopped up the world. Yeah, I mean, the colonialities of this are absolutely about teaching our bodies to work differently, categorising. So yes, definitely. If I'd have started off there, I'm guessing, well, but yes, so I absolutely agree with you in terms of, this doesn't even like cut the surface as a conversation really, but it is a conversation and it's a way in. And from my point of view, I don't know, maybe I don't know whether you agree or not. No, but you know, there's so much learning that, and we're going to have to relearn, right? Because generationally, if we don't keep this stuff going, which is why I do think the intergenerational aspects of this and the cuttings in are quite deliberate in relation to the programme and the work that we're all doing. So, yeah, don't know, more questions? I'm used to chairing as well.
I just wanted to quickly add that this is the ideal scenario where a white person and a person of colour can have a conversation about race and it doesn't turn into like a weird, uncomfortable, personalised thing, you know? It's actually that, right? We have worked at it, but I think sometimes it's underestimated how much emotional labour is involved by a person of colour having to deal with that.
Yeah.
We will come back to, we're out of time for questions in this section, but there will be more opportunities. We are going to have a Q&A later on. We will be shortly moving into a break, but before that we have another treat. We are going to hear from the wonderful Khadija Ibrahim again, who's going to recite a few of her poems to us. Just to reflect before I bring Khadija on though, this emotional labour that was discussed is important for everyone. It doesn't matter what your colour is. I think that ability to see and hear each other, and what I'm newer to the conversations with Shona than Jo is, but what I like about her approach is her humility and her self-consciousness, that she doesn't have the answers and she's willing to listen. She studies this, she's an expert, but on a personal level, she's very open, and if we can all go with that open heart and open mind, I think that's where these conversations can start to heal themselves. We can't fix everyone, but there we go. So, Khadija, I'd love to invite you back up. Thank you. And can we give them a round of applause, please?
The first poem that I read, Union Jack, really relates back to my parents coming from Jamaica. And my mother would always say, I should have gone back home when rivers of blood ran deep in the current of Enoch Powell's hate. And she was talking about the rivers of blood. So we're going from the Windrush movement of 1947. My mother arrived in the 60s. And in 1968, Enoch Powell made his speech to his constituency in Birmingham. So that's where that comes from. I grew up hearing this name and not knowing about what that concerned. But what I realised was, I'm just thinking about the discussion, what I realised as a black child, I was always in white spaces and having to defend myself in school, in and outside of school. But there was something else that was happening. It just wasn't me. It was a range of people from my community. This year, a revolutionary song. This year, This year, a revolutionary song. This year, There was fire, fire, no fire, fire. Youth Rage 1975, Warrior Charge. Remember the 5th of November, a day to throw away your old things on the road. Hold street competitions to build the biggest bonfire just for boast. In 1975, Chapeltown lit up into a riot attack so fierce the police almost had to surrender. Parents and leaders rallied to halt. A heavy police presence came to clash and assault. Fire engines circled to hose down fires. The law's boots crept between foliage in gardens, and from an undercover CID car on Spencer Place, a gust of angry voices flew. From Francis Street to the Grange Avenue to Rossington Grove, 300 youth rose up. Silence erupted into flames. In a warrior charge fueled by anger, the tinder of frustration. As rehashed tales of teddy boys chasing down their fathers, heavy on their minds were false arrests, raids on blues dance and local houses. Youth battled West Yorkshire police. It was Beirut in Leeds, cuss-up and screams. Not even Marvin Baker's prayers could stop the clash of race and hate. Black Mariah at the ready, a convoy coming slow and menacing, swinging truncheons, dogs at the side. Youth them at the ready, broken bricks at the sides, bonfire debris stacked to varnish an artillery. In the heat of stones, beat and cussing, a CID car got torched, but not one local car was touched. Not a scratch, not a dent. But Mr. Morris, the local steel pan player, coming home from work in his van, was snatched and arrested. Not a word to his wife. 12 youth arrested, some taken out of school on essay confessions. Mrs. Paul, the head teacher at Elmhurst, brought black lawyers from London. Most were free, 4 served sentences. What a day, what a night, what a tribulation. There was fire, fire. Youth Rage 1981. We never imagined the night would happen again. We never imagined this night would happen again. Rioting a stone's throw away from my house. 6 years later, man and woman raised up a passion, set out the street like arena for a bullfight with the Babylon. There was fire, fire. Disturbed hearts smashed bricks through the smoky heat. Exploded against discrimination, sus laws and racist attacks of these inner city streets now burnt to ash because there was all else to do. But sign on. Get your UB40, your passport to collect your dough. In our back-to-back and through terrace houses, working class black and white youth played snap. The Sex Pistols latched onto the white heat, graffitied Elizabeth's head, stuck 2 fingers up and spat on the Union Jack. We watched them pogo dancing up and down to the clash white riot of reggae snatched rhythms while Maggie snatched milk, brought recessions and the poll tax. And when the specials rocked against racism, well, they marched right past my street, up to Potter Newton Park till it was like a zebra crossing, black and white, black and white, black and white, as far as you can see. Rock against racism. Thank you.
I recognise that nobody in Huddersfield was really going to be commemorating partition. I remember when it was the 50th anniversary, a lot of the first migrant communities, the first generation, members were really proactive. They might have worked in the council, so they would have, when it was the 50th anniversary, put on lots of activities and events. But when it came to the 70th anniversary, a lot of those members had retired or they were old, and there wasn't really much that the council was doing, and the younger generation, when I was going out speaking about partition, knew very little about it. So that's why I felt compelled to start that journey to create this heritage project. And I've done heritage projects before, but this was the first time I was doing a project about my own community and the Sikh community and the Muslim community from Huddersfield. So that was the starting point. Also, when I was younger, my dad told me a little bit about partition of India, and I always remember in my mind when he used to talk about this white line that was drawn, and I was too young to understand what that meant, that line that separated these communities. And what I found really interesting was that when my dad would tell me that these two communities, or the Hindu and the Muslim and the Sikh communities were divided, that he ended up in a country where he was connected back to those communities, the Muslim communities. So it made me think very deeply about the British Empire that draws this line and divides these communities, then decides to invite these young men to help build the economy in this country. So there's this realignment and this reconfiguration of these communities. But interestingly, these young men never talk about what happened to their families and their ancestors back home. It was never discussed. Partition was never ever discussed. So that was another reason why I was hoping that this project would open up those conversations. And it was a real process for me, because it was really difficult for people to have those start talking about partition. So it was a really slow process. But as you can see, 10 people we interviewed. Zoe, the filmmaker, and I interviewed 10 people. But in fact, we interviewed, I think, over 30 people for our oral history project. And that information, it's all available online on the White Line website. So that was the starting point.
So do you want to add anything?
In terms of the starting point for the film, I was kind of brought in a little bit later.
questions from the audience? I'm sure we've got quite a few. No? How did it feel? So I've got a question for you. Mandeep, you talked about your father never speaking and the young men not speaking about partition. How did it make you feel as a second generation Indian talking about that to the older generation?
Well, my dad was 5 years old when partition took place, so he was very much protected by, you know, insulated by his family. So his family did move from West Punjab to East Punjab. There were many that, you know, when that divide took place, they were, as you say, on the right side, so they didn't have to leave everything behind. But he was really, really young. So I imagine a lot of the young men that arrived, their experiences will have been very different to their parents' experience. And a lot of that older generation came here as well. But again, it was not a conversation that people had. I think when something traumatic like that happens as a mass group of people, you have a choice. And when something has traumatized me personally, I'm able to speak. But if it's a mass group of people, you have to pull together. So you have to find that strength because everybody is suffering. And I think that trauma, for many, also meant you just didn't talk about it. You had to think about the future now, not the past.
It felt like,
Sorry.
It's okay. When we were talking to the people that we interviewed, that initially, like when they were going through this traumatic experience, it wasn't like they were thinking of it at that time of the scale of it and what massive thing. Sorry.
I'm sure this is working too well. Put it in your mouth, maybe.
Sorry. It's like they weren't thinking at the time the scale of it and what this huge traumatic thing was. They were just kind of focused on getting through it and where they were going to go next and what was going to happen. And it wasn't even until we spoke to some of the people that they'd never even talked about it to their own families. It was just kind of like this focus on moving on and getting through it.
And one interesting thing was there's a gentleman who's got the turban on, and he just when we first approached him, he said, "Why are you doing this film? It's not going to make any difference. You know, why do we need to talk about it?" And I mean, my response was, you know, the younger generation will get a sort of an idea because it's more personal. There was a lot of stuff on the television and on the radio, and you know, people were making theatre productions about partition at the time, so that we were getting a lot of exposure. But I think hearing stories that were from your local community resonated. But interestingly, when I dropped off the film when it was ready, I gave it to him. He was away out of the country, so I had to post it in his letterbox. And a couple of weeks later, I called him and I said, you know, did you receive the film? And the very gentleman who said, look, why are you doing this? He said, I sat down with my grandchild, who's 14 years old, and we watched it together and we cried together. And he said there was a real sense of healing because she had a lot of questions she asked and she knew nothing about it. And I thought, wow, that was what it was about. So, you know, it started those conversations. Also, when we first started the project, the application got rejected, so I had to resubmit the application to Heritage Lottery Fund, and so we had to reduce the scale of the project. But one thing I thought was really important was to produce an education resource pack. That work that we would have done with the schools didn't take place because we had to scale it down. But it was really important that we produce something and then we share it online, that if there's any teachers, because when I was at school, I didn't learn about anything to do with my history. So that information is available as well. So, you know, it was reaching the younger audience as well.
Thank you.
Hiya. So I guess my question is really linked to some of the things that you've been talking about. When I think about any, you know, my grandparents, they also went through partition. When I think about, how did you get people to talk? And what was that process like? I guess I'm really interested in the relationships that you must have had to have formed with people.
Yeah.
And I'd like to hear more about that.
So I really wanted to interview my dad for this project, but he's a real introvert, he's really shy, and he wouldn't agree to get involved. But he has had a lot of contacts in the community, and a lot of his friends, like when I was young, my dad had friends from the Muslim community, so you know, I had an uncle from the Sikh community and an uncle from the Muslim community, and so he was able to sort of help me make these connections. And I think also because he already had these strong connections, it was easier to navigate and have that conversation, even though it was difficult. But then there were also people who I didn't know, or my dad didn't know, because we did a call out, and that process took a little bit more time because people didn't want to come forward. So if somebody else saw the call out, they would recommend somebody from the community, and then I would try and make that connection. But those members of the community, men and women, you know, initially I started with the connections via my dad. So he was one of the researchers, I guess.
Fantastic, thank you. We have a question up there.
Yes, I just want to ask if you're making any connections with what's happening currently, because there's a new Prime Minister's been elected, isn't there? A new...
Re-elected. President Modi, he's been re-elected.
Re-elected, and there are some concerns currently about, you know, sort of sentiments, animosity between Hindu and Muslim communities. Just snippets of news that I've been
So
seeing.
you will notice there's not much information about sort of the politics, because that's one thing, like if you wanted information about what happened in the past, the political landscape, you can find that stuff online. But when it comes to the stories on the ground, I found it very difficult to find information about that. So our stories were more about personal people's hidden stories, and not so much about what is going on now. And I know I know very little about the politics of what's happening in India or Pakistan now.
Yeah.
I'll be
Yeah,
really
no,
honest.
my question might be a very naive question, because I mean I'm really very ignorant to the situation. But I was really asking if some of that, some of those atrocities that took place, if there is a real fear at the moment that some of that same stuff could be repeated or about to be repeated under the current regime. I mean, as I said, my question might be naive because I don't know the, you know, the background, but I thought.
So I'll take this very briefly. I think, as Mandeep said, the film itself wasn't strictly about the politics, but at the time, if we reflect back to the film and we think about some of the lines that they said, that we must talk about what happened so that it doesn't happen again, and divide and rule, what happened in India during that time. And I can speak very personally about my grandfather, who I discovered later was a very sweet man. He spoke perfect English, and I only discovered about a year and a half ago that he was in a nationalist party, and he did some very unspeakable things. You know, I haven't been told what he did. The current government, they are Hindu nationalists, and so there is a danger. And again, in India, parallel to here, this is why these discussions, you know, open discussions and connection between humans as human beings is so important, so that we don't see that it's when we dehumanise people that atrocities happen. As the man said so nicely in your video, he said people went mad. And it is a bit like wherever we are in the world, people, when they're whipped into a frenzy, these kind of things occur. And when we come together as human beings and see the whites of each other's eyes, that's where we hopefully prevent these things from happening in history. Great. I think we've got time for one more quick question.
Hi there. It's not a question, it's a really quick observation. Just first of all, I thought it was a remarkable film. It was incredible, so thank you for making it. My really quick observation was just, I noted that one of the gentlemen in the film talked about how quickly people can learn to hate within literally days. And it just made me think, gosh, this was only made a couple of years ago, I assume.
Yeah.
Seeing it today, it just makes me think about how suddenly people can believe that all Mexicans are rapists, and that immigrants and refugees are destroying European civilization. And it feels like a really pertinent time to see the film. So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're Tribe Arts, and we're a theatre company that's based in Leeds. We want to explain to you a bit about some of our experiences and building on some of the conversations that have happened today. All very pertinent. We were itching to ask questions, but since we were going to have our own little section, I thought, well, I'll just leave it for that. So I don't really want to do a PowerPoint presentation for you. What I want to do is be a bit more interactive and open up the conversation. So if there's anything that comes to mind as I'm speaking, please just put your hand up and one of us will come to you, or maybe we'll get somebody else, maybe. So yeah, please feel free to ask those conversations. So I do want this to be interactive. I know you were making a mistake actually with this now, because it doesn't look, you can't tell which one's the... you can't tell which one... Okay, so I want to just start with a bit about who we are and a bit about our story as a theatre company. So we basically were a group of 5 actors that were all cast in a show about 5 years ago, something like that. A mix of black and Asian people, and we kind of didn't really know each other. But as an actor, if anybody else is an actor in the audience, it's a very lonely job. You kind of go to a job, you don't really get to know anybody, you have to learn your lines, you do the job and then you kind of go home. You don't have any meaningful connections, you don't make any kind of lasting friendships. But I think Tribe for us was completely different.
Yeah, we had a lasting friendship, kind of. As you can see, there's only 2 of us now, so we'll tell you more about that in a bit.
We'll get to that story. I think the thing that really binded us, though, is the fact that we all were of a similar thought. So we all were, we were all very revolutionary. We were all kind of a bit like rebels. We were all talking about empire. We were all talking about rights and civil liberties and all that kind of stuff. So that's really the locus of where our conversations died as a theatre company. And I think really the other thing that compounded it was the absolute exhaustion of us as people of colour, and actors, just being really fed up of going to castings and being put up for terrorists and taxi drivers and shopkeepers and can you do an Indian accent, and and I'm like, no, I can do a Jamaican accent if you want. That would really creep the hell out of it. But it was just that frustration, and we were just really sick and tired of being cast in these menial roles that never had any purpose, and we were just seen as functional bodies. Like, if you've got a black person in the show, that person has to do something, right? There's a political thing that person has to do. You can't, or it could just be there for colour, literally. So for us, we were just really sick and tired of that as actors, and so we wanted to take control of the narrative, and we wanted to take control of the story and create our own stories. And being second, third generation Asians in this country, we are in a very unique position where we understand where we come from, the roots, but we also are obviously from this country. And so for us, there was this really unique insight as to how we could make something of, address some of the concerns that were happening, that kind of, these stories about partition and stuff like that, these are very relevant stories, very moving stories, but like it's rightly mentioned, it's not a memory that I have any, I don't have any memory of that, I wasn't around. And so there is this disconnect with the history that you hear about, which is quite emotive, and my own lived experience in this country. So what I can link in with is the racism, the discrimination, and all that kind of stuff. But obviously that was on a completely different level to what we're talking about now. Not to say that it's not serious now, because it is, but it's just in a very clever way. But we'll get into that in just a moment. As a theatre company, so for what we're really interested in is bringing our root stories alive and reframing them for a second and third generation audience. So people who understand about being British, but also understand wherever else they come from. And I think the unique thing about our theatre company is that we're not an Asian theatre company. We're not just a black theatre company. We're trying to actually meld the two stories together because there are shared histories. And, you know, we were sort of looking into it all like in the 60s and the 70s when this was rife in this country, like even in America, like there was this whole camaraderie of coming together. You know, I would have been called a black person in the 70s as much as anybody else, whereas now there's a difference in how we're categorised, and I think we've lost that a little bit. So as a theatre company, we're trying to bring that back because we're living in very turbulent times still.
Also, what's important in doing that as well, we also acknowledge the fact that it wasn't just that Asian people stopped being called black, there was also a move from within the communities as well. So it's also about addressing that difference between the two communities and also how one community felt differently about having that label attached to them. So it's not just saying that it just happened naturally, do you know what I mean? It happened because there was some colorism, there was shadism, and there was prejudice amongst the two communities as well.
Because like now, my dad would probably be like really offended maybe if he's called a black person. He'll be like, no, I'm Asian. But actually, there's something different about how that needs to be addressed, and I think that's what we're trying to bring back. So we just call ourselves a theatre company, but we're neither an Asian or a black theatre company. We're just a theatre company that wants to. And I'm doing that wrong. So I just want to also go into. I want to frame this conversation that I'm going to open up. Yep.
So I wanted to pick you up on the thing you said. You're radical political.
Yeah.
I was just wondering in what ways you're radical.
I'm going to get into that now. That's exactly what I'm going to talk about. So yes, we're not, just to directly answer that, we're not radical in the sense that we kind of make work with placards on the stage and saying, go and take down your governments down or do something radical like that. That's not what we're talking about. For us, our radicalism is through the art that we make and through the way that we're trying to change mindsets. So if we can affect somebody who comes in with a completely different idea to what we think, what we believe as racism or what we believe as, you know, all the beliefs that we have, and if someone comes in with a completely different mindset, if we can at least make them question or think or affect their mindset in some way, for us that's a very radical stance because it's just not happening often enough. I just want to frame this conversation with some of the reason why we feel like we're best placed to have this conversation. As actors, we're working in the entertainment industry that is actually the biggest factor of how some of the stereotypes and prejudices may have formed. People sometimes are introduced to ideas about race only because they've seen it on TV or represented on stage. So for us, the entertainment and creative industries are the locus of race relations. We're at the forefront of where this kind of stuff is happening day in, day out. I mean, as an actor, I might not get a role because I'm too fat, too black, too short, can't do the accent right. And it's a very discriminatory industry, and that's just what you have to deal with as an actor. I'm not just talking about as black actors, that would happen maybe to a white person as well. But the point is that there is a difference in the way that we're looked upon within the industry. And also, there are many initiatives within our industry to try and address some of the issues. For instance, we have this thing called colourblind casting, which was an initiative that was set up within the arts where they wanted to get more black faces on stage, but not just on stage, but also writers, producers, directors. The problem with that, even though it was, the intentions are right, the problem with that for us was we were being assimilated into stories that weren't ours. So, for instance, if I wanted to be in, in a Charles Dickens play, my name would have to be, Oliver Twist. And, there'd be a really radical retaking of what that Oliver Twist would be. They've got a black person playing Oliver Twist. That's really amazing. It's really, really, creative. And that's the problem for us, because we were just like, that's not our story. And so we have a problem with colourblind casting in terms of how it tries to address it.
Also, the definition of colourblind is the whole thing about I don't see race, I don't see colour, and that itself is really problematic as well.
And then just also the constitution of black artists within the industry. Like there's very few stories of success of where black artists have actually made it and they're really doing successful. They were always usually classed as emerging or developing or in this sort of process of, and I usually say that that our industry is a microcosm of society. That's a picture of actually one of the articles that I wrote in The Stage, just addressing that exact issue, where this is why these problems are structural and societal. This is nothing individual about it. This is all to do with how power works as a system. And so, and the very few black artists that do actually make it, you know, there's so many stories as to how that's happened. You know, there's so many things that we don't realise of how that's happened. And we can unpack some of that, maybe. And also, just to pick on the categorisation and segmentation, which we think is a feature of Western epistemology. This kind of harks back to, and I won't go too deep into it, but for us, like, it kind of goes back into the Victorian age of how there was an obsession of classification, and how they kind of wanted to see everything as fitting neatly into certain parts and constituents. And around this time, this is when the empire started rising. And so with that, compounded with the rise in science, with Darwinism and all that kind of stuff that was going on at the time, all of these things came together in a crucible, which resulted in what is happening today in terms of how race is now defined. We'll get into this in a bit more detail, but that's, for us, I just wanted to frame the conversation in that way. God, it's not working now. Okay. So I want to start off by talking about terminologies. Diversity, equality, and the myth of meaning. For us, what we want to talk about is how these terminologies shape some of our understandings of race, both within our industry but also wider on a societal level. And if anybody has any ideas about how to address some of these questions or what their take on this is, it'd be really interesting to know. But what really is diversity? What is equality? What is multiculturalism? I think someone mentioned before that it's maybe not much on the agenda much anymore. You don't really hear about it too much. And why do they exist? So for us, and I think this is what was really striking to us about Shona's project, when we talk about race, it's very obvious to us that whiteness as a structural power is absent from those conversations. So for us, when we talk about diversity, again, whiteness is absent from that. And that is a problem to us because this is how you get that power dynamic where there is a them and an us. And for us, what we're trying to do through our work is we're trying to bring that dimension into the conversation so that we can have meaningful conversations. Are you asking a question?
I want to ask. Well, because it strikes me that it's potentially important, this thing about the conversations about whiteness, because in some ways it's everywhere, but in some ways it's still nowhere, you know, and I'm wondering, what is that about? You know, is that just who I follow on Twitter? Or probably, you know, partly, I don't know, do you know, or a serious question, and is it about the location in where we are? Is there something specific, like for you guys, you know, about here, about where we are in Yorkshire, or, you know?
For me, the way I've actually got a note written about this because I wanted to make this point. I'm so glad you've asked this question actually, because now I don't need to. But for me, like, if we say that race is a construct, which I think it's generally agreed that it is, and scientifically there is no basis for race. I mean, that's something that Alice Roberts, if you watch any of her documentaries, will say. But at the time when these concepts of race were being thought out, informed by Darwinism, informed by categorization and all that kind of stuff, it was expedient for whiteness to create a construct of race and to therefore then segmentize various people in certain ways and sort of say, well, we're on the top and this is the ladder down. But now, weirdly enough, it's become expedient not to talk about race because there's a problem. So now suddenly everything that used to have a racial dimension suddenly doesn't, and the word equality fits in. So for instance, we used to have the Race Relations Act in this country, now it's called the Equalities Act. And so everything is very structural and it happens over a long period of time. And these changes come about, and that's for me, that's why I think whiteness is absent but also not absent at the same time, because it is there when it needs to be there and it's not there when it doesn't.
I think it's also because it was effectively white Europeans who classified what race was. So you've got scientists like Carl Linnaeus, a Swedish scientist, who's really celebrated, and he was well known for defining and classifying organisms of plants, but he was also known for classifying human beings. So there was four, I'll try and remember these, so there was four categories that he came up with. So it was African, and the African was described as lazy, negligent, and black. You had the Asian, which is the East Asian people, or the Mongoloids, they called them later on, and they were described as being voracious and pale and ill-looking. Then there was the Native Americans, who were described as red-skinned and angry. And then there was white people that were described as gentle, inventive, and white. And it's around that time when a lot of Europeans started taking that classification on and calling themselves white people. So I think to answer that question, because they're the rule makers and they're the ones that made the rules, and that, for that reason alone, they are the status quo.
But I think that's where some of the problems happen with because I'll talk to you about some of the work that we've done. But when we've done similar sort of forums about this, we do get a lot of white people not understanding how they are the rule makers. They don't understand that. So and so for us, we want to start at that level of the conversation. Is how do we go? Let's go right back to the origins of the words like racism and where that comes, because even the word racism is bandied about so much in contexts that don't actually mean that they are racist. And just to pick on the point that you just made there, the whole thing about representation, I was mentioning colourblind casting earlier on. So one of the things that really struck me, and it was like a really weird moment, I was like, so as a black person, I could be put into a play, and I would be the only black person in that play, but that part might not be written for, you know, an Asian guy or a Muslim guy or a Hindu guy. It's just a diverse role. And so we're interchangeable. It doesn't matter if you get a black person in there or an Asian person or any, that's what we are. Whereas you would never see the reverse. You would never see a white person cast as a black person. A white role in a play is a white role. And so for us, that was like, when I had that moment, I was like, that is the warpedness of how we're representing race in film, TV, media, and then generally, you know, further on. Just want to get past this slide because the next one's juicier. What is Eurocentric, white-dominated, and the global south? So again, we're talking about terminologies. We're talking about where these terminologies come from and how they describe what they describe. They haven't just come out of a black hole. Sorry for the pun. But we'll get. I think we'll get to that as we kind of move on. I've also mentioned briefly about the Race Relations Act, law versus white privilege for us. So the idea when I explained about the washing down really of Race Relations Act turning it into Equalities Act, the washing down of the word racism to what it now means, to what it actually meant about 50 years ago. This is all happening through a long and slow and sustained campaign of political correctness that's slowly changed the spaces, white spaces, in how things can be conducted, what can be talked about, what cannot be talked about. And I think the biggest thing in this country is the lack of critical race theory, which obviously exists in America because of the long history of civil rights and all that kind of stuff that's happened there. And I think that's probably the thing that we're missing in this country, of why we can't progress conversations about race. The importance of being earnest, black integration in white spaces. What we wanted to just talk about here is, and I'm just throwing these ideas out because I want you guys to try and talk about this once I've done with my diatribe. There is a, and I think it's been picked on before. There is a sense of a certain way of behaving within white spaces for people of colour. There's a certain way that we have to conduct ourselves, the way we would talk. We would talk differently to, you know, people on our street, for instance, our local community, to how we would conduct ourselves in, you know, other spaces that have different types of power structures. And so for us, white spaces, when we talk about white spaces, we're talking about spaces that are absolute and all-pervasive in every manner. We don't just mean the spaces dimensionally. We mean the way that the power structures are laid out. Do we have a seat at the table? even asking that kind of conversation, even asking that question is problematic. Like, why do we not? Why is it that we should ask for a seat at the table? And what is the table, you know, in that scenario? So, and how can integration also be multicultural, where we're told to integrate as people of colour, even as artists of colour, like, you know, we have to integrate our work and make it accessible, but at the same time we are asked to also be multicultural and express our diversity. So there seems to be two opposing ideas that don't quite work there. And just to kind of talk a little bit about specifically black artists, I've mentioned the whole thing about whiteness from conversations about race. I think that's one of the critical points of contention that we have, where conversations about race are not being moved forward. And then to also talk about high art and popular culture. So there is this categorization of art within consumption. High art generally being things like opera and, you know, even plays, I guess, Shakespeare, stuff like that. And popular culture being stuff that's anything but street, urban, yeah. And so there is this dynamic of how that's defined. And this might be a controversial point, capitalism and consumerism is the new empire, where it's colonizing our minds through these channels of high art and popular culture. So everything is now, there's choice, there's appropriation. You know, if you want the whole thing about package holidays, you know, that's a very, very Western epistemology. To go somewhere on a package, like, it's just not even, like, if you think about the layers of how we have slowly been conditioned in the way that we live in a society. So it's all of these kind of philosophies and these political points that we're trying to get into our work. And the way that we kind of addressed that, one of the shows that we did, well, the first show that we did was called Tribe Talks. And basically Tribe Talks is the BBC's Question Time, or TED Talks, interspersed with live performance, music and film. So it's a sort of a very dissimilar, not a very dissimilar setting to this. And the idea basically is that we talk about these subjects openly in a safe space where there isn't any kind of hindrance of backlash. And so that's one of the ways that for us as a theatre company we're trying to address some of these problems, and we're trying to not just talk about these things with our communities, but also to put it in some of the stage work that we're doing as well. We can talk a bit more about that, but what we've realised through some of the work that we've been creating is that actually our work has been seen as quite decolonial. And that was quite interesting to us, because we never intended it to be decolonial. It was just the way that we made the work was just the way that it was coming to us, and that's how we were creating the work. But there is this big push now, isn't there, for like decolonialisation.
I think personally, being whatever you want to call it, Black, Asian, BAME, whatever the latest title is, I think being that and being on stage and even being here now having these conversations is decolonial within itself.
Yeah. That's the end of my slide. So we've got a few questions. I think. Yeah, go on, do that.
My question was around language, actually. You mentioned different ways to talk about non-white people, BAME, BME, POC, politically black. And my question to you is, by calling everybody black who isn't white, you did talk about the segmentation through eugenesis in the 19th century as a negative, which I agree that it is.
Yeah.
But surely by lumping everyone together as a monolith, that when there is anti-blackness within the BME communities, whatever they are, and there is also discrimination to other sections, surely that creates a problem in and of itself. Sorry if I didn't make any sense.
No, that completely makes sense. So we went to an event in Birmingham, which I think you were there as well. Yeah. And Kathleen Cleaver was there, who was part of the original part of the Black Panthers, and that's exactly the question that I asked, which was, as an Asian person, actually I didn't say Asian person, I said as a black person, didn't I? And that's when I got heckled out. I said as a black person. But then there was a black woman behind me who says, but you are black. But she was talking from her generation. She understood what I was trying to say, but it was a younger generation that was saying that you're not. And I think, I was like, okay. But yes, I get the question that you're asking, and I think that's why the word politically black is, the word political is the functional word there, because there's a reason politically to understand the struggles, the shared experiences. That's not to say that these communities don't have their own struggles and their own representations and their own problems and their own things that they want to address. But I think that would be a misrepresentation of what I think political black is, for me. So I completely take the point, but I think that's what needs to be reclaimed. And I think maybe the generations that were before kind of understood that, because that was the way. I mean, you can't have an interpretation about it. If there's two people, one's black and one's Asian, they're both being called black by a white person, there's no interpretation to that. So at the time, that was something that was accepted, whereas now we feel like there is a difference.
Two questions, so we've got one there and one there. Would you mind sharing that?
I can do without the mic, I've got a big voice. See where you want to give me the
Just
mic.
in case anyone struggles to hear
Yeah,
us better.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to jump onto the this statement that you made earlier. Well, yeah, the statement that you said that you've met some white people who really don't understand the fact that exactly what you said, that there's a white privilege and that they actually have, like, to use that horrible word, the whip hand. Because I mean, it seems amazing to me because, to be fair, the new, as my friend said up there, there's all these titles. I didn't even know what BAME meant. I actually thought, but apparently it's British and Asian minority ethnic. We are an ethnic minority within this country, but you know, when you look at the world as a whole, then people from the Caucasian mountains, they're the minority. We, you know, and even integration, and they're saying, oh, we should integrate and all this stuff. I don't know if some of them realise that means that they're going to be more of a minority, because what you're seeing now is you're seeing people from, you know, you're seeing Caucasian people having interracial relationships with a lot of different races, so they will end up being a minority.
They've predicted a year as to when the whole world will be, or there's a year, isn't it?
Yeah.
They've predicted the year.
America, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
But then you've got those people who didn't understand, and really, at the end of the day, the world is still run by. It's certainly the money world is run by some of the Jewish, the Rothschilds, and the other people, and for want of a better term, they are white people. So of course they've got the you know, of course they are the ones that are controlling things. I just can't even understand how somebody. I don't think they do it purposefully. I just think it's so ingrained that they don't even see it.
Okay.
Yeah, of course.
Oh, we've got someone up there first.
All right.
Okay. Did you have any
the only thing I want to say to that is, I guess, yeah, no, I completely take your point. I think that's the paradox in the whole argument, isn't it? Where we've become so conditioned to being referred to as an ethnic minority, and where, you know, for one, we're cool with that at the moment. But as soon as that the conversation turns into a global perspective, that would be an issue. And I think that's the thing that we want to address as a theatre company, is why is that an issue? Because then that shows the power dynamics, doesn't it?
Of course it does.
So yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
In the last slide you mentioned that capitalism falls as consumerism is the new empire, but I question that quite a lot, because there's always been this capitalism and consumerism as long as there have been these definitions of race. From the beginning of capitalism, there was always these definitions of race, and black and Asian people had quite a distinctly different role in the history of capitalism. And the fact that West African people were transported to the other side of the world, I don't think that Asian people had the same crisis or the same genocide. So on one hand, I'm not trying to play colorism, I'm not trying to say that black and Asian people can't be united against racism, because they do both share the burden of being threatened by the expansion of capitalism. But there are, and it doesn't have to be one way or the other, but there are differences as well. And more than anything, what I'm trying to say is that at times you can look at it as a whole, and they can be unified, and at other times you can look at the differences between the two groups.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, but I think it's also important to remember that people from the Indian subcontinent are probably, I won't say they were moved around more than anyone else, but they were moved around quite a bit. So you had about 3 million Indians that were taken to the Caribbean islands. to replace the African slaves, and they were rebranded as indentured servants. They were also taken to islands in the Australasia, like Fiji. They were also taken to parts of Africa. Of course, yeah, the stories were all different, and it's going back to what someone mentioned earlier on about divide and conquer. A lot of times, when the Indian man was taken to certain parts of Africa, he was put on a pedestal just above the indigenous Africans. And that's why you had people like Idi Amin who wanted the Asians to leave Uganda. And until this day, I wouldn't say I support him, but at the same time, I understand where he was coming from, because it was like, either give up your British identity that the British people gave you and be one of us and be united with us, or leave the country. And I kind of get where they were coming from, because the Indians were taken there and put on a pedestal compared to the actual people who were indigenous to that nation.
But that's exactly the kind of point that we're trying to address with the work that we've got, because if we don't have forums like this where all of us come together and talk about those differences, because of course the Indian and the black experiences are not the same, you know, they're completely two different histories. But that's not to say, as British people in this country, we cannot come down and create some kind of way forward for future generations. And I think for me and Sam, that's one of the things that we're trying to do with our work, is how is it that our work and the theatre practice that we're trying to do, how is it that we can bring in a diverse audience, for want of a better word. Actually, we have the reverse problem in our shows. We have the problem, how do we get more white people in to see our shows? So for us, that's one of the things that we're trying to address. And how is it that we can then but then also make entertaining work? You know, our stuff doesn't need to be functional and political all the time. Like, you can just come and have a good time to see some of our shows. You know, you don't need to bring your encyclopedia with you. But it is about trying to highlight some of these differences, like you've mentioned.
We've got a question up there.
Yes, ma'am.
Sam, would you mind taking the mic?
Yeah, of course.
I love the spark you have to try and provoke and push in a sector I know very well, theatre. And I'm just drawn to the decolonised theatre notion. To decolonise, I get a bit trapped in words sometimes, and I'm trying to see what the world looks like. I think I know what colonisation looks like. I'm not sure anymore I know what decolonisation looks like. Could you just paint that world for me in theatre? And that might help me translate into other areas of my life as well.
Yeah, good question. For us, we had no idea what we were doing was decolonial. But just a very direct example, for instance, when we did Tribe Talks, it was basically you had a panel of people, you had the audience, and we then served a 3-course menu to the audience, which was free, by the way. You missed out. But one of the things that we realised actually in that, and we didn't realise at the time, but we changed it, was that the panel were on a pedestal in front of a table. And that is a very colonial way of presenting a discussion. I mean, having a lectern is a very colonial way of presenting a discussion. So for us, it was about really trying to think outside the box and think about how can our theatre practice be informed by some of our cultural inspirations, like discussion and forums and things that are a very rich part of India. They were called mehfils in India, and so you would have these regularly. And how is that? What can we learn from those? And how are those kind of forms and practices better at moving conversations forward? Also, one of the ways that I think for us was decolonial was the way that we were mixing up form. So when we did Tribe Talks originally, we presented it to a few people. They just couldn't understand what it was. They were like, is it a theatre show? Is it a discussion? Is it a Q&A? And for us, that's very decolonial. As someone from India, like if anyone's seen a Bollywood film, there's got action, comedy, and romance all in one. So you don't just have and they're all not, they're called musicals in this country, but they're not called musicals in India. It's just a film. And so for us, that whole mishmash way of creating things is just the way that it just happened, didn't it? We didn't actually know that that's how we were doing it. That's just the best way to tell the story. So that's just a very specific example about how Tribe Talks is decolonial. But then moving forward with some of our other work, I guess some of our decolonial work is in the ideas, not just in the way that we present it. So one of the shows that we're working on is called Jerk Chicken Samosa. It's a sort of black comedy about two restaurants on the same street. One's an Indian restaurant, the other one's a black corn fish and chip shop, and it's about how they sort of compete for business, and then through that competition they start realising they're a lot similar to what they thirst for, and it also charts the rise of British Bhangra and hip hop in this country. So I mean, that was for us, we've not come across a story like that, and for us, just having that kind of a viewpoint, it's neither a black or Asian story. It's a story about the communities and their shared experiences over a certain period of time, and so nobody else other than people like us, I guess, would have been able to tell that story. So that's maybe what decolonial theatre is. We're still working it out, to be honest with you.
Yeah, again, I'm not going to be asking a question, I'm just making a tiny little observation. It might sound a bit pedantic, but it goes back to a point that was made earlier in the audience about where power lies. And I think probably most of us here would agree that power rests disproportionately, globally, with white men. But I'm a bit personally uncomfortable with the notion that power rests disproportionately with Jewish people. And I'm also uncomfortable with the idea that Judaism is synonymous with whiteness, because it isn't actually. There are many, many, many black Jewish people. I just think we need to be a bit careful.
Yeah. And those kind of ideas actually are really interlinked with other histories like the World War and all the other stuff that was going on around that time, and how that's come down to being a stereotype. You know, when you think about... Oh, Mike, do I really need a mic?
I think you might need a mic.
And I think that's for us, representation is a really important thing. And when we see something on TV, stage, wherever, we read about something, how do you get rid of a stereotype? How is it that you can learn your mind to not have that picture in your head when you read something about, you know, a Jewish person, a black person, whatever? And so for us, that's the challenge that we've got as artists to try and address that. But yeah, you're right. That's one of the things that power as well is a very important thing for us. That how do we assess power? How do we the characters that we have in our shows? How is it that we can decolonize them, I guess, and work away from the stereotype, but also be true to what people recognise, you know? I think that's a lot.
Any more questions, final questions for Todd, Colin, Summer? Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's really inspiring for me. I'm really interested in representation. I'm working and researching in this area, and also about survival as artists who are hopefully doing decolonial work. And I'm just wondering, how do you survive as a company? So is it through funding? How are you able to continue working and producing this work? And also just a question about your audiences. I didn't get whether you said whether they were white audiences or BME.
I mean, well, we want to present our work to as diverse an audience as we can. I think for us, it depends on the show that we're talking about. With Tribe Talks, for us, because we're focusing on the Black Nation story and all the ramifications that come from that, it's like an echo chamber if you don't have white people there. Because what we've noticed is that because everybody knows the deal. Everybody knows what we're talking about amongst people of colour, because these are shared experiences that everyone has had. So, you know, we just tend to agree with each other, and the conversations are very interesting, but they're not affecting change. And so for us, it's very, very important, which is what drew us to your project really, is how is it that we can bring whiteness into that without it feeling like it needs to be attacked? Because these conversations about race are very, very personal, because that's how people see race. That's how people develop stereotypes and prejudices from their own thinking. And so for us, that is one of the challenges that we have. So our audience is predominantly second, third generation Black and Asian people, because we're trying to get it's the kind of work that me and Sam would make. What's the kind of work that me and Sam would go and see? If we get a few white people on the way, fantastic. I think for us, the challenge is in marketing. So for instance, how do we market a show like Tribe Talks in Bradford as opposed to Harrogate? If you put on something that you're going to talk about the Empire in Harrogate, it would need to be completely marketed in a different way to how it's going to be told, and that's the challenge that we have, I think. Have I answered the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Hi.
On that point, If you were going to call a show Jerk Chicken and Samosa, how is that going to attract a white audience?
Yeah.
And, so, you said it's in your marketing, but you give yourself a problem potentially by only making your marketing accessible to people who understand it.
I totally get your point, and I would throw the question back to white people, and I would say, well, why isn't it that you would not come to see this kind of show? When we are actually doing Tribe Talks, when we were doing Tribe Talks, we actually got some calls, didn't we? We got some calls from white people who were saying, can I come and see this show? Is it for me? And that really took me by surprise, because I was like, as an Asian person, I would never ring the Work Social Playhouse and say, can I come and see Romeo and Juliet? Right? So that shows to me the level of multiculturalism and who multiculturalism applies to, and who integration applies to, because it doesn't just apply to people of colour, it also applies to white people. Because if we're living in a multicultural society, there's no way that you can be multicultural if one section of society is completely stringent on the way that they think and they have no notion of their surroundings. That just doesn't work. And so for us, one of the things that we're trying to do is to break down those kind of barriers, those mental barriers, that why would a white person suddenly not want to come to see a show because it's got the word samosa in it and jerk chicken? Yes. They're very tasty. Thank you.
That was, again, very thought-provoking. You will have some opportunity to ask them further questions in the panel discussion shortly, but we're now going to hear the crowning by Khadija.
Just before I read the poem, it's quite interesting. I don't even know what that was. It BME? I don't know, because I don't lock it in my system, because I don't feel I'm part of that word that's been coined, because it was never asked to me if I liked it. I never sat at the table. There was no seat was given to me at the table to say, this is yet another description to call you. So I don't use it, and I don't use it. I don't. And I feel quite sad when I hear other people using it to describe themselves. I love words, and when I was growing up, I would hear these, what I called big words, and I think, what does that mean? And that was the thing that got me looking at words in dictionaries. And ethnic, the root of that word, means heathen and pagan. And not because I say so, because Mr. Oxford and Cambridge say so. And words are being coined all the time. So if you look for it now, it'll describe what it is now in present time. But if you go back to, maybe you can go to the 90s and see the meaning of the word, or the 80s. And you can see the meaning of the word heathens and pagans, unbelievers. So I think it's quite interesting that is ascribed to black people. And obviously minority coming from minor, less than. So we are heathens and pagans, and we are less than. This thing that they, in terms of the enslavement of African people, so decolonizing the archives is like decolonizing theatre. We have to decolonize the archives. That means we have to reclaim and rewrite it. And we do that as artists, and we do that as scholars and educators, and we do that as just everyday people, to decolonize and to rewrite it and to correct it in so many shapes and forms. Growing up, the Rasta movement was very prevalent, and we knew the term black because of the Black Power movement, and it represented us as a people in terms of reclaiming the word black as something very positive, very powerful, very beautiful, as opposed to the negative that was ascribed to it. but also we were Africans. We were Africans because that's what we are, removed from Africa and enslaved. So words like the slaves from Africa, they were not slaves from Africa, they were Africans enslaved. So these are the words that we start to do when we begin to decolonize the archives. So the reason why I mention this is because the crowning has got a lot to do with that. We were Africans. Rastafari, who was born in Ethiopia, was crowned in 1930 as Haile Selassie, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering lion of the crown of Judah. And Marcus Garvey, who was a Jamaican, prophesied and said, look to the east, and there you'll see a king. And this was prophesied way before Selassie was crowned. And in 1966, Emperor Selassie visited Jamaica. In the time of 1930, when he was crowned, then came the birth of Rastafari. And that movement is the movement that gave strength to youth in Jamaica, throughout the Caribbean, but also in Britain. So I grew up with Rastafari around me that said, you're black and you're beautiful and you're powerful and you're an African, first and foremost. And I remember going to school, primary school, and the teacher says, where do you all come from? And I said, Africa. And in my head, I thought, is that possible? Because I was born in St. James's Hospital. But I'm stick with that story. And I thought, if she says where, because I was only young, so I thought Africa was a country. I didn't know then. I was only young. And then I told my auntie, would I get in trouble because I told the teacher I came from Africa? And she says, you do come from Africa. And then she's told me these various countries. And she thought maybe it would be Ghana. And so I stick with that. I just wanted to share that with you. The very fact of the crowning of Selassie is the very fact of how we decolonize the archives. Because Ethiopia was never colonized. It was occupied, but never colonized. The crowning. Empress, dread queens, kings, children of the African diaspora, come, draw your circle of listeners. Speak your truth on legacy of empire, enslaved packed ships where ancestors were tossed like pebbles into the ocean. Come, warriors, soul rebels, singers of the blues, spirit of the purple dawn, bring us Solomon's wiser history. For we readers, pen stressers, dust blowers from basement libraries, knowledge stackers, frequent travellers in the natural mystic breeze, weave lion. In the whirlwind, weave the flag, the red, black, green of it. In Garvey's starliner, we connect the mediums beyond those ships. So bring your melodies, song makers, chants and dance. Reclaim, we name, and bury the pain. Bring to this ceremony clay pots, calabashes, incense and oils, and tell the people then become. Come with your head wraps and your guinea heads. Come with your cornrows, your afros and your natty dread. Bring your harmonies and your comeliness and the wisdom in your navel string. Bring the ancient prescriptions. Bring priest, drums, silk white robes, burn 7 oils in 7 corners for 7 days, and read 9 Psalms of David without ceasing. Come purify we, so we recognize the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, Jah Rastafari. When we say Jah, you can say Rastafari. It's a natural process. Jah Rastafari. Jah Rastafari. Selassie. Thank you.
We've heard so much today, and if you're feeling as I am right now, there's so much going on inside. I've got personally a lot of questions. What I'd like to do is to invite each of our panellists just to share a few perspectives from themselves about what they think we've heard and discussed today, and then invite all of you to give your comments as well. So, if you're here, can I start with you, please, Taj?
Yeah, I think the range of stuff that we've talked about today, even though it's been linking in with quite a few of the things, I think that's the kind of conversations we need to be having in a multicultural, mature country. Those are the kind of conversations that even now, in the throes of Brexit, are so important. And it is a bit shameful, to be honest with you, that a country like Britain that has such a history can call itself multicultural, but the vast majority of the population has no notion of what that actually means. And I think it's events like these and the kind of conversations that we've had today that really express what that multiculturalism is. And it's more of these kind of conversations where people can share ideas and share experiences. Doesn't mean that they have to necessarily agree with anything, but just to have these kind of forums, I think, is really important. So yeah, thank you so much, Sean.
That's on too.
Yeah, it's kind of off the back of what Taj said. It's really important to have these kind of conversations. I also think, obviously today, we've only had 3 hours, so we've touched the tip of the iceberg. But as someone said earlier on, we're not really scratching the surface, but we're not getting into the deep depths of it. And I think it's only when we get into the deep depths of it that the real conversation will start. I still think that won't be the end of it, but that's where we need to get to. And but yeah, the turnout was good in here. I'm quite surprised. So yeah.
Oh, fancy! I've got a mic right here.
Your own mic, then you get your
mic. No, just really listening to the speakers and the concept of looking at what people think is race, what is racism, what is decolonising, what is theatre, what, who would come to see what, has been quite interesting. So my perspective is I'm an observer, so I observe a lot and then I write it, and then I think of ideas of how that poem may fit in with what's happening today. So I'm not the radical this, I'm going to chant down this, I'm going to write about it. Yeah, I'm going to write about it and just really try to deconstruct it and build it back up for a sense of understanding. So that's what I do in terms of my work as a writer and as a theatre practitioner.
Always observing. Is it working? Can I start? Okay.
Transfixed.
No, well, actually, no. I mean, seriously, it is, because I think, from my point of view, that careful kind of that careful observing, the deconstruction, no matter how you kind of conceptualise that, is absolutely fundamental to the ability, if we have any such thing, to be able to stop and feel and know whatever it is we think we know at that moment. And I think that's something that actually is decolonial in and of itself. And it goes back to this kind of question, the person that raised the question has gone actually, but this thing about the scratching the surface, right? And my response was partly about epistemologies, but actually it was about ontologies, and it was about bodies, and it was about how our being in the world is utterly, and I'm saying our there very explicitly, not to suggest a similarity of experience, but to suggest that we are all framed through this dynamic in the present, here and now. And so to be able to sit with that and try and understand what that means for you, for me, for whatever, that's like a gift that you give us, actually. So thank you. but it's actually a serious part of praxis, I think. We've took, you know, that we don't kind of, and again, the we, they're very deliberate. I don't use we in like a slot. I'm being very deliberate here, and it's not necessarily uncontentious, so that's why I'm signalling it in a way. But I think that's crucial to be able to unpacking whiteness. Because for me, whiteness, I mean, the thing that I could have said, I kind of started off differently today, is that whiteness is a racial formation. I mean, I kind of feel like I repeat myself a lot. But by that, it's like, it's not a thing about skin, which is why people shift in and out, right? It's about power, it's about capital. This issue of the historical construction of race was no accident. Our racial labelling is about the explicit use of power via race, right? It's not that we are all a race, if you want to put it like that, but these are things that are constructed, and the only, for me, this is why I start through the language of power. I really want to understand how power works, because that then takes me to an understanding of race in the dynamic of theatre, in the dynamic of writing, in the dynamic of conversation. And that's really what I've seen happening and hearing, and what I'm seeing challenged, and also sat back within this evening. So I think that's my comment. I've got loads of questions as well.
I don't know if this one works. Oh, yes, it does. Here's one I prepared earlier. Right. Is it my turn? I can't remember. Is it my turn? Oh, it's my turn. Right.
Yeah, it's all right. It's just somebody wanting a question already.
Oh, okay.
No, but carry on.
Okay. So, I think for me, what makes these kinds of opportunities, what makes me really feel grateful for these kinds of opportunities is that we try to consciously come out of those imposed socialised frameworks in terms of how we discuss race. I think too often it's difficult. These are all difficult conversations, but I think quite often they are positioned as in, you know, I mean, for example, you in the audience, I didn't catch your name, but you mentioned your point around Black history, Asian history, the contexts of genocide, the contexts of oppression, how that plays out in how we self-identify today, and so on. And that's a really prevalent point for me, because I think what I'm quite conscious of, and what I hope that we will continue to be able to do, is to step outside of those micro-narratives and to come into the here and now in terms of the way we're viewed through the lens of whiteness is orientalized to the point where through that lens it doesn't matter what minority we are, we're still going to be subjected to a racialized oppression. So it's not about devalidating the experience of a community or devalidating anybody's history by having these discussions. It's acknowledging all of that, which I think is in the mass narrative, but it's also accepting that the end result in the here and now, in the British context most certainly, is just complete socialisation. The only time that I have ever genuinely felt post-racial in anything that I think is the idea of Sajid Javid being Prime Minister, which I really would not want to happen on any level. And that's the only time I'll feel like I can identify the difference, you know. But the reason I'm addressing that point is because it hits me. I feel that, you know. I don't want it to ever come across like I'm participating in conversations or I'm contributing to conversations that are devaluing or devalidating the experiences of communities, you know. So, yeah, I'm grateful for these opportunities because I don't think they happen frequently enough. I think it's too polarised usually, as I said before. But, right, on.
I just wanted to share this one incident that I had one time with my dad. It was when, when you do the consensus, every, how many years?
Well, not anymore, but up until...
Seven years. And there was this thing going around where a few people said if you put Jedi on there, and if there's so many numbers listed as Jedi, that the next consensus it'll be listed there. So I decided to put Jedi on there. And before I put the form in the envelope, my dad had a look at it, and he looked really puzzled. He didn't say anything immediately. He went out of the room and then he came back, and the first question was, you come from a Sikh family. Are you not, you're not proud to be Sikh? And even though my dad's from a communist family and my mum's from a more practicing Sikh family, my dad is a humanist. And what I loved was his response. He said, can you not be a Sikh Jedi? And so that just told me everything, that I can not be just one thing, I can still be everything. And I just love that. And, that's a beautiful mindset that my dad sort of shared with me. And yeah, I just wanted to share that with you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, everybody. I feel like we've been on quite a journey this evening, and a little bit like Khadija was saying, I feel like I'm a bit of an observer, and my means of expressing that is through film. So I think it was quite interesting. I think the lady's left now, but how she was saying that watching that film was still quite powerful. Now, in a different sense, obviously it has its purpose of telling the story of partition from the perspective of people from Huddersfield, but she's finding a new purpose in it as well in today's society, and I find that really interesting, and I think tonight's kind of bringing up ideas of where we can go next with that and how it can progress.
Thank you, everyone. That was a beautiful story about Sikh Jedis.
It's like I was probably the only person that was Sikh Jedi. Honestly.
So they didn't give you that as a categorisation.
But it's a great point, and supporting Khadija's point about the use of BME, I don't take that on board either. And I was quite surprised, I must say, to see that on the slides. But even that, I can't remember, Shona, you called it neoliberal accounting? Is that what we were referring to there?
Well, I would say that, those forms of categorisation fit into
that
a set of...
That at the start of the day was of the evening was so pertinent, I think, just to recognise that there are labels that are assigned that we don't necessarily have to take on, because how can we have power if we have to ask for power? So reflections from the floor.
Thank you.
No, what I've just realised is I don't think I've ever thought I have to explain myself. And I think maybe if you have a colour, you might have to explain yourself sometimes. Well, I've never felt that I stood out, unless I want to stand out, have a dress or something. And I've never felt anyone would say, how come you live here? Though I wasn't born here. But so that's what I take just the point. I've never felt that I've had to explain myself in any way, and it would be really tiring to have to explain yourself all the time, wouldn't it? Because you're just a person. So why should you have to explain yourself? That's all. That's what I can take from the whole thing.
I think if you don't come into that category of white, because I hate all those labels, but if you don't come into that category of white and you enter a space, straight away you're explaining yourself, even if you're not saying anything, because you have to, what I do, and I'm sure many people may feel the same, there's a mental preparation to leave your home. to what will take place that day. You don't know. It could be going from touching your hair, and an example, people touching my hair, and people thinking it's okay to do that. To go around touching people's hair. And I think the only hair that's ever been touched is black women's hair. Whether you've got an afro, or you've got dreadlocks, or you've got plaits, or whatever it is your hair is, the touching of the hair, where do you come from?
That's what I mean. I can see it now.
Just having to, I don't do it, because I don't feel that I need to justify anything in that space. But you can see the eyes are already on you and the questions are already being asked. And you have to make a decision if you're prepared to answer those questions, or you're just going to be present in that space. And sometimes you can't even be present in that space without something taking place. And there's a sense of isolation as well. And so when you're in a place like Britain, whether you're born in Britain or not, that is a daily chore that many of us go through.
No, I see that. I mean, clearly, if I went somewhere else, I should have to explain myself, wouldn't I?
Maybe
I might
not.
Be born in that way.
Maybe not.
It depends if it's an ex-colony. Because if it's an ex-colony, then more than likely the structures within that society still exist.
Anyway, I can't say any more. I can just say that's the time.
Yeah. So we have a question from here.
It's an observation and a question at the same time. The invisibility of whiteness, that comes together with power, because power is invisible.
Absolutely.
And whiteness has been, it's a race, but it has been perceived as it is invisible. And Richard Dyers writes about, and that's how it gets to this powerful position, by perceived that it's invisible, it's unmarked, whereas people of colour were marked in this kind of racial dynamics. And my question is about the terminologies and things like diversity, for example. It's meant to give us synthesized kind of version of, we are in a post-racial society, therefore we have equality. We don't have racism. We're calling for diversity because it's good to have, rather that we have a problem to address. And I'm just wondering, but how do we, and same with BME categorizations, how do we get around functioning in society, writing about it, for example, as academics, or working in institutional spaces and policies where we have these words, so diversity policies, equality policies, BME, we have to function in this space, but we have to unsettle it at the same time, and I don't know how we can do that. So.
Great question.
That's one of the reasons why the slide that we did was actually called On Being Desired and Derided, because we're at the same time desired for the cultural package that we bring, but also at the same time derided for the fact that there's a diversity problem. And so there is this really weird dynamic, this paradoxical dynamic going on at the same time, where and it actually goes back to the question that you asked about how do you fund yourselves. Like, that is, unfortunately, we have to speak a certain language to be able to, and we have to work within the power structures that exist to be able to remain functional. But by doing so, we're actually doing a disservice to the philosophy that we've just talked to you about. And so there's this really, and that's where a lot of the mental illness comes from. So, and we have to be mad on stage. But that's it's a catch-22 situation, and I think, and it's one of those things where I think terminology is really, really important. Reclaiming words is very, very important. I think that's happened in some of our cultures and various words where they have been reclaimed, but I think they stay very local. And I think, again, I would go back to if white people are not present in those conversations, they are not going to move forward. It's just as simple as that. And that's the only way that you can create some of those changes, especially in this country. If we're living in the West, then they have to be part of the conversation. It would be a very completely different conversation in India, for instance. But then maybe weirdly enough, it'll be the same, because there's a whole notion of that society still aspiring to be the West. I mean, before it was they would speak the Queen's English, and now suddenly they realise Britain isn't really a major player as much as it was, and now it's American, and now suddenly they're all speaking Americanized English in India. So there is this really weird dynamic that's happening globally, not just in this country, it's happening globally, where there is this this current that just goes towards the West, and that's the fight. That is the fight that people of colour are fighting all across the world in various different, you know, systems that they can, either as an artist, an academic, a writer, you know, a filmmaker.
Thank you. So we have a couple of minutes for a point from Shona. I think we have a final question, and then we will be hearing from Khadija once more.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really important, actually. We do have terminologies that don't reference groups, and I think this is really crucial because official terminology chooses to categorise for a particular reason because it suits organisational purposes across all sorts of... I don't use those forms of... I talk about racialisations and people who are racialised in particular ways. So I come back to, I feel so strongly about this, because the terminology stuff is absolutely crucial. It shifts and changes and we get caught up in these discussions, and I think that is part of how power works. We talk about what are we going to call ourselves, or whoever one day, or who got to name, and the naming process is important, but I think name the processes. And from me, that's absolutely crucial. And there are loads of language, they pop out and they get taken back again because it doesn't serve categorisation purposes, and power works through those. So that's fundamental, and I think it relates to a lot of the discussions we were having, you know. I don't know whether I'm allowed or not.
Just very briefly, but quick question back to Jo and then
just really quickly, I'd say play the game. Use the terminology to get a seat at the table, so you can use agency and power. I mean, the thing is, I think there is this ideological utopia where there is true equality, but I think the whole point of tonight, in a way, has been to acknowledge that there's a socialised dynamic here, and part of that is categorisation and a specific lexicon. So, as dirty as that may make one feel, and I know I, you know, feel dirty. I can't believe I just said that on camera. I hope that doesn't get edited in some funny way. I'm sure it won't. But the point is, I know that by sitting at that table that's talking about inclusion and using that lexicon, I'm able to have some agency and some power and some say in how that then plays out to the communities on a micro level that I'm a part of that get affected on an institutional level. But ideal scenario, we move away from that at some point.
And the power dynamic as to who uses.
Yeah,
like
uses well.
Work together.
Really quick
I'm going to make this really quick then. I think there's been some really good talk tonight, and I thought, sorry, I don't know the lady's name, but the white lady over there, I think you were very brave because, do you know what it is? You have to feel uncomfortable in having these conversations. It's essential, you know. The word that I actually hate is when I hear people saying inclusion, because when I hear somebody saying, oh, you need to assimilate, the word assimilate actually was assimilate. Yeah. To me, that seems to say that, because they only ever say it when it's someone who's normally quite bigoted and they want you to think like them. So, you know, I mean, I'm ashamed to say that my mum's, she voted when it was for Brexit, she voted, and I said, well, Mum, why did you vote to leave? And she said, because I don't want any more Muslims in the country. And my mum was an immigrant at one stage as well. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So this is where we are. So yes, we have to feel uncomfortable, and so well done. I think you did feel uncomfortable, but that will only make you stronger, and we all have to feel uncomfortable. Good. Well, yeah, fantastic.
That was a great point to finish us on.
Sorry, Ange, can I just say one thing very quickly? Sorry, I just wanted to say that the word assimilation in itself, to me, is the ultimate example of how fascism has percolated into our language and into our systems of oppression. what are we assimilating to? Are we assimilating to a performativity of what it is to be white? Because that's all fiction, right? Or are we assimilating to the idea of a binary, bigoted narrative whereby we just don't accept each other? So that word, yeah, that always riles me up a little bit.
So this is the last piece I'm going to read, Returning Home, Another Crossing. This is dedicated to Travis Johnson OB. He actually was one of the founders of the Jamaican Society, alongside other things that he was part of. You come at England so long, long ago. From the island of wood and spring, blue mountains so high, sun so hot. 3 counties and 14 parishes. With a twinkle in your eye and a twirl in your hat. You left your family ties way, way back in 1962. Everything you knew about life was where you come from. A young, daring, strong-boned 18-year-old. You come clear, clear across the ocean with your sweet talk. And your luggage in your hand. Your suitcase filled with what you own, what you could carry, with ambitions to achieve and the promise to return home someday. Over 40 years or more, you're there, England, in the cold with its funky sunshine and plenty, plenty rainfall. You drive bus and train for British Rail. And still, nothing much. You smile like your wife, Betsy, and your children, and your love for back home, where you dream to build your house. You was a man of many words. Set your mind to management structures of Leeds Jamaican society, with your ideas of unity and social rights. You brought people from all over. Jamaican High Commissioner, dignitaries, too much to mention. Even the poet and folklorist, Miss Lou, passed through. Originate her idea of a Jamaica house, where people could come and gather and stay. A storyteller, campaigner, race relations advisor, housing matters. A churchgoer, you knew it all. You set a plan with your wife to go back home. Put down money to buy bricks and mortar to build your home. To make better your dreams of a home. Fit for a king and queen. And when the time came, you pack up your dears in England. A job well done. Me never thinks that I would reach Jamaica to hear your name called. How your house so pretty till I turn red. Dear Mr. Johnson, you never lived long enough to enjoy the dream. But you knew something more than we, since you're gone upon another crossing to a bigger and better place. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our contributors today for all of your time and your insights, and to the audience for participating so well. The reason I've just asked Khadija to give me her book was because there were some lines in there that I'd like to repeat to Shona and to Joe, because I think they were so perfect. And I'm not sure I'll find them quickly, but they were along these lines. It's, you've brought people from all over you've brought people from all over today, and we're starting this discussion. I'm not sure how many dignitaries we have here.
Just Joe's family.
Exactly. So, storytellers though, campaigners, race relation advisors, we have it all in this room, and we have power ourselves. So, safe speed home. I wish you all a good journey. As I say, please continue the discussion because it starts with us ourselves. Thank you. Thank you.